Good afternoon. The first item of business today is portfolio questions, and in order to get as many people in as possible, I'd be grateful for short and succinct questions and answers to match, please. Question number 1, Marco Biaggi.
Ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to tackle air pollution in cities.
Minister Paul Wheelhouse.
The Scottish Government is working closely in partnership with local authorities, SEPA and others to improve air quality in our cities. We recently consulted on a review of the local air quality management system, and I plan to announce next steps shortly. It is worth highlighting that while I acknowledge there are still some hotspots of poor air quality in a number of urban areas which are of concern, we should note that we have, as a society, been able to reduce nitrogen oxide pollution by 65% since 1990, as well as having reduced particulates by 58% and sulphur dioxide by 79%.
Marco Biaggi.
Almost a year ago, the Cowgate, Grassmarket, London Road, Gorgie Road and Inverleith Row in my constituency was added to Princes Street, George Street and Royal Mile in the areas that were officially above the safe limits for pollution. What message would the Minister give to the City of Edinburgh Council in terms of what they can do, and when roughly can we look forward to hearing about these new steps that he alluded to in his answer?
Minister.
Well, Mr Biaggi is absolutely right. Our government is constantly in contact with local authorities across Scotland. We have regular contact with City of Edinburgh Council on a number of issues, including its air quality management areas that are under its management at the moment, of which there are 5 in Edinburgh, as he identifies. The Council has produced a comprehensive air quality action plan and is working to implement it with support from the Scottish Government and others. And annual progress reports indicate that progress is being made in implementing the plan, examples in use of hybrid buses and rerouting of some routes to reduce air quality pressures, but we'll obviously keep the member informed as to progress as it goes forward.
Question number 2, Rob Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what form the scheduled review of the Wildlife and Natural Environment Scotland Act 2011 will take in relation to deer management.
Minister Paul Wheelhouse.
There is no current planned review of the Wildlife and Natural Environment Scotland Act 2011 in relation to deer management. The Wild Deer Strategy, Scotland's Wild Deer, a national approach, launched in November 2008, is, however, to undergo a 5-year review to examine progress and ensure that the strategy remains relevant to the deer sector in Scotland.
Rob Gibson.
Thank you, Minister. Arising from the compelling evidence gathered by the Iraqi Committee into deer management, can the Minister review the uneven development of deer management plans, which are often discussed in private, against the undoubted pressures of deer densities which are adversely affecting the range of native woodland and other biodiversity markers in an already fragile habitat?
Minister.
This is an important issue, and it's one, of course, that we'll be interested to hear the outcome of the Rural Affairs and Climate Change Committee's deliberations on the topic of deer management following its recent evidence sessions. The revised legislation and the SNH Code of Practice on Deer Management has not been in place for very long. I think it is important that SNH continues to promote good practice in deer management, to promote the Deer Code and to further develop related best practice guidance and support deer management groups. There will be an opportunity when the Deer Code is reviewed to consider standards in deer management and whether current arrangements are delivering sustainable deer management. SNH has a duty to monitor compliance with the Deer Code, and if SNH feels the current Deer Code is proving ineffective, it may submit a revised or replacement code to Scottish Ministers for approval by the Scottish Parliament.
Thank you. Question number 3, Christina McKelvey.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what recent discussions it has had with Scottish Water on its flood prevention plan for Hamilton and the surrounding areas.
Minister Paul Wheelhouse.
The Scottish Government has regular discussions with Scottish Water and its regulators about improvements to drainage infrastructure, both in terms of the delivery of the current investment programme for 2010 to 15 and that plan for 2015 to 21. Scottish Water is a member of the Clyde and Loch Lomond Local Plan District Partnership, which covers the Hamilton area. This partnership is actively working on the development of a local flood risk management plan, including identifying the most appropriate actions to manage flooding in the area, no matter what the source. This partnership approach to managing flood risk will enable all the partners to invest and take action where the greatest risks and benefits have been identified.
Christina McKelvey.
Minister, for that answer. Can I make the Minister aware of an ongoing issue with flooding in the Chatelet and Waterside Gardens area of Hamilton, my constituency? This is a long-term issue in which I have pursued the Council, Scottish Water and the Fures Association to resolve. Can I ask the Minister to look at what action he can take to resolve this issue to the satisfaction of my constituents, and ask his opinion on meetings being held between the Council and Scottish Water where I have been deliberately excluded?
Paul Wheelhouse.
I thank the member for raising the issue. I think on the issue of the meetings, I would take that first. I know there has been an initial technical meeting, which I understand the member wasn't able to attend, and there will, however, be a public meeting to discuss the outcome of the studies, which will be arranged shortly, to which members of the public and elected representatives, such as Christina McKelvey, will be invited. And I certainly recognise the important role that the constituency member can have in a situation like this to help inform our constituents of the plan and, importantly, get feedback on the plan as well to relay both to Scottish Water and to the local authority. I do understand, however, Scottish Water and the Council have been working together to understand the sources of the flooding problem in Hamilton, which is what led to the meeting in question, and officials are due to meet on the 11th of December to discuss the technical details arising from the ongoing studies, but I do undertake to make sure that the member is informed of the public meeting and make sure she has an opportunity to attend.
Supplementary, Drew Smith. Sorry, Mr Smith, we need your microphone. Thank you.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Last month it was reported in the press that the SNP have diverted £800,000 from Scottish Water to promote the publicity budget for the White Paper. Will the Minister confirm to Parliament that this is indeed true? And what impact does he think that decision will have on Scottish Water's capacity to do its clearly vital job in Hamilton and indeed across Scotland?
Minister.
As the member may appreciate, I don't have portfolio responsibility for Scottish Water, so I'm not aware of the background to the point that he has raised, but I'm sure we can write to the member with the details of what funding has or has not been taken from Scottish Water. It's just genuinely an issue I have no knowledge of, I'm afraid, Mr Smith.
Question number 4, John Scott.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what discussions it has had with Quality Meat Scotland, the National Farmers Union and others about the sufficiency of primary product to meet the growing worldwide demand for Scottish food and drink.
Cabinet Secretary Richard Lockhead.
It is, of course, important that we have the supply to meet the burgeoning demand in our food and drink sector and take advantage of these opportunities. One of the products most in demand is indeed our fantastic red meat, which has a reputation throughout the world for provenance and quality. And to ensure we can respond to the growing demand, I have asked Jim McLaren, the Chair of Quality Meat Scotland, to establish a short-life industry working group to examine what can be done to upscale the supply of primary beef production. And, of course, we hope to have the recommendations in late spring.
John Scott.
Rather negates my next question, but I'll ask it anyway. The Cabinet Secretary is better aware than me of the decline in suckler herds and the decline in sheep numbers and overall meat production in recent years in Scotland. He will also be aware of the emerging lack of critical mass in the beef industry as many Scottish cattle go south for finishing and processing, and all this at a time when Scottish processors and retailers are growing their markets worldwide thanks to the efforts of Scottish food and drink. Does he agree with me that there is a risk to Scotland's food exporting capability at the very time our exports are growing, our food production is reducing, and if so, what is he doing to encourage production?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, firstly, I would urge our beef farmers, in particular in Scotland, to produce for the fantastic export markets that are developing around the whole of the world. And it would be unfortunate if we did not have the supply available to take advantage of these opportunities for Scotland's economy and for our food and drink industry in particular. Of course, there are a number of factors that affect the affordability and viability of producing beef, and the Common Agricultural Policy reforms will have to take that into account in terms of how we implement that in Scotland. Also, the industry itself, of course, if the most efficient farmers were able to pass on their knowledge to other farmers and they were all able to cut costs, that would of course help each individual business as well. So there's a number of factors which should be taken into account, business changes as well as making sure we've got the right support mechanisms in place.
Question number 5, Drew Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on the World Forum on Natural Capital, which was held in Edinburgh recently.
Minister Paul Wheelhouse.
Over 400 people from 35 countries attended the World Forum on Natural Capital in Edinburgh on the 21st and 22nd November. This event brought together a wide range of interests. World-class speakers debated issues and concepts that affect us all and can help us understand the value of nature and the impact our actions can have on the environment. The First Minister addressed the conference and he was pleased to welcome the delegates to Scotland and affirm the Scottish Government recognises that Scotland's diverse natural environment is a valuable national asset. He welcomed the formation of a Scottish Forum on Natural Capital that will bring together public, private and voluntary sector organisations to work together to help protect and rebuild Scotland's natural capital. An early focus of the forum will be to consider how to restore Scotland's highly valued peatlands. The Scottish Government welcomes the announcement made at the close of the conference that the second World Forum on Natural Capital will also be held in Scotland in 2015.
Drew Smith.
Thank you, President Officer, and I thank the Minister for that comprehensive response. He might be aware, and other members may also be aware, of who may have received a number of emails, that the concept of natural capital is not without its critics. I have, though, however, read the very helpful briefing which has been provided by the Scottish Wildlife Trust, which argues that while nature should be priceless, that does not mean that it is valueless. What reassurance can the Minister offer to those who are concerned about commodification of natural assets because they fear it may lead to marketisation, and what work is SNH and other government agencies involved in to gauge the appropriateness of the natural capital approach?
Minister.
Well, I thank the member for raising those points, because I think he's done it in a very constructive way, and he's absolutely right that we want to provide reassurance to people that this approach doesn't undermine the protection of the environment. We are certainly, I think, wanting to avoid putting a price on nature as such, but valuing nature, and we feel valuing nature in this way and the services it provides to society is not the same as placing a monetary figure on it. And so natural capital is one of the ways in which we can tell whether our economic growth is truly sustainable. Certainly, the SNH and others are involved in producing information like the Natural Capital Index, which is in its infancy at this stage, but it is an important means by which we can start to measure the value of what we have in Scotland and, importantly, target improvements in the stock of natural capital over a period of time, and certainly welcome the members' interest in this issue.
Question number 6, Murdo Fraser.
To ask the Scottish Government what research it has conducted on red squirrel resistance to the pox virus.
Minister Paul Wheelhouse.
Recent research by Dr Julian Chantry from the University of Liverpool and his PhD student Tim Dale, which discovered that some red squirrels were resistant to the squirrel pox virus, was presented at a recent conference organised by the Red Squirrel Survival Trust. As yet, no comparable work has been carried out in Scotland to look at the presence of squirrel pox antibodies in red squirrel populations that have been exposed to the virus. The Morden Research Institute is peripherally involved as they undertake all of the blood testing on red and grey squirrels. Both the study carried out by Dr Julian Chantry and an earlier study that was reported in 2008 suggest that around 10% of red squirrels exposed to the virus are able to survive the infection. The reasons for this are not yet well understood.
Murdo Fraser.
Can I thank the Minister for his comprehensive response? Like him, I was interested to read the reports of red squirrels in Merseyside developing immunity to the squirrel pox virus. Can I encourage him to have the government agencies work on this issue to see if research can be done in Scotland on this issue? And I wonder if at the same time he could have some research conducted into the use of immunocontraceptives as a means of controlling the grey squirrel population. Minister.
Well, clearly I recognise that the member's interest in this, and there is clearly an importance, and particularly in areas like Tayside, for example, in controlling the spread of grey squirrels into territory, which is the heartland of red squirrel populations. So we'll continue to take advice from SNH and others on the most appropriate methods of controlling the numbers, but at the moment we don't have a sort of a programme of the kind that Murdo Fraser has described. However, I think it's important that we do take as much involvement as possible in supporting all approaches to tackling the problem of squirrel pox virus.
Supplementary, Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Could I ask the Minister further about the detail of the range of interventions to support red squirrels and protect them further in South Scotland, particularly in view of the concerns at Paxton House, where there are no longer any red squirrels, and in relation to the corridors of concern going up into the northern parts of Scotland?
Minister.
Well, clearly, I recognise the member's long-held interest in this issue, and indeed have met her and other MSPs to discuss the problems that have arisen at Paxton House with John Hume Robertson and others. The Red Squirrels in South Scotland project, which is now merged with Saving Scotland's Red Squirrels, form a national red squirrel conservation scheme, is carrying out grey squirrel control to isolate squirrel pox virus outbreak zones and establish pox containment around these areas in the south of Scotland. The squirrel pox surveillance programme, which is made up of a partnership of red squirrels in South Scotland, Scotland, Morden Research Institute and the Royal Dick School of Veterinary Studies, Edinburgh, test diseased red squirrel specimens for signs of squirrelpox virus and other pathogens, and undertakes antibody and tissue tests in grey squirrels to detect and map exposure to squirrelpox virus. The programme of squirrelpox virus surveillance in South Scotland has been continued and extended under Phase 2 of the Saving Scotland's Red Squirrel project up to 2014, and SNH and Forestry Commission Scotland both contribute to the SSRS core funds and are part of the steering group, and SNH is contributing currently £350,000 to the project over 2 years. So I hope that gives the member reassurance we are taking every step we possibly can at this moment to control the problem in South of Scotland, recognising it's an important line of defence against the virus spreading into the red squirrel population.
Thank you. Question number 7, Duncan McNeill.
Could you please accept my apologies, Deputy Presiding Officer, not being here at the start of the questions. A very interesting meeting with Patient Opinion Scotland, and I talked too much as usual, so that's why I was late. Can I ask the Scottish Government, when the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs and the Environment last met the Chief Executive of Zero Waste Scotland and Keep Scotland Beautiful, and what was discussed?
Cabinet Secretary.
I met with Ian Gullen, the Director of Zero Waste Scotland, most recently at the opening of Dryden Aqua's award-winning glass reprocessing plant, which took place 2 weeks ago, a fantastic company for Scotland and project with international benefits. We discussed what can be done to help the company source recycled glass from households across Scotland when we were chatting. And on the 20th of March this year, I hosted a summit to discuss Scotland's litter problem, where I met all key stakeholders, including the Chief Executive of Keep Scotland Beautiful. And of course, we discussed a range of ideas to help tackle litter across Scotland.
Thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response. I also welcome the Cabinet Secretary's statement in regard to proposed Scottish Government legislation to tackle fly tipping and all other forms of antisocial behaviour that blights the Inverclyde area and other environments right across Scotland. 19,000 fly tipping incidents reported in Inverclyde over the last 5 years, 4,000 of them in the last year. When can we expect to propose legislation, and what can we do in the meantime to tackle this issue?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank the member for these various points, and I'm sure we all share the condemnation of these people in Scotland who think it's acceptable behaviour to litter their own communities in Scotland's beautiful landscapes. The member is right, of course. We are addressing this by putting through legislation. Indeed, the amendments were passed this morning at stage 2 in front of the committee to increase the fixed penalties for littering from £50 to £80 and to quadruple fly tipping fixed penalties to £200 from the 1st of April 2014. We also will publish our updated litter strategy next year, and I'd be happy to bring that subject back to Parliament for debate. I know many members have got strong feelings on what to do to tackle litter, and of course, if anyone's got any ideas, I'd be delighted to hear from them in the meantime. But I do hope we can do our best to persuade the people of Scotland to look after their own country and to support Keep Scotland's Beautiful campaign, Clean Up Scotland.
Claire Baker.
The Scottish Government have published draft regulations for a single-use bag levy, which mirrors the Welsh regulations. Northern Ireland's levy exempts hot food, and the EU recently announced proposals that are very focused on reducing plastic bag usage. What is the Cabinet Secretary's view of arguments for increasing the exemptions within the schedule to include paper bags that would be used for takeaway food?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, we do have a desire to listen to people's views on these particular issues and exemptions. I think, however, there's widespread support for the general thrust of the legislation, which is to introduce a levy on single-use bags. And given that there's a range of benefits being experienced by other countries with similar bans in place, we should certainly follow suit in this country. But certainly there are a number of issues, of course, to be ironed out in the detail of the legislation, and I do have an open mind as to how we can address those issues.
Thank you. Question number 8, John Finney.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on the review of wild fisheries management that it announced during the passage of the Aquaculture and Fisheries Scotland Act 2013.
Minister Paul Wheelhouse.
I know there's considerable interest in the future management arrangements for wild fisheries, both across the Chamber and outside it. I'm committed to undertaking such a review, and I'm currently considering the scope and remit of the review. I expect to make an announcement on the timing and scope of the review shortly.
John Finney.
I thank the Minister for that response. Minister, I understand there's a number of waters in Scotland under community control, but not under community ownership, and indeed some of these have salmon rights which have been donated to a town or indeed a club. I'm particularly interested in where the potential exists for community interest to conflict with the wider public interest, and I've written the Scottish Land Review Group about that. I wonder if the Minister would agree for the Scottish Government to examine wild fishing rights and laws, and those in New Zealand and Nova Scotia have been commended to me, to see what lessons, if any, can be learnt for Scotland to democratise this issue, please.
Minister.
Well, I'm certainly very happy to look at any constructive suggestions, whether it's New Zealand has been raised a number of times, and I'm aware there are different arrangements in Canada which would be of interest to us to study. I think the first step is to identify what the conservation needs are for Scotland's wild fishery, and then to develop solutions that fit the conservation needs. So I'm happy to look at any types of solutions that the members in the Chamber feel would help address that, and that's indeed what our review would hope to cover. But we'll, as I say, we'll come back to the Chamber and to the member with more detail on what the review will do, and certainly happy to look at New Zealand and Canada examples he cited.
Brief supplementary, Jamie McGregor.
Thank you. In order to aid the management of wild fisheries, particularly on the West Coast where runs have declined, and in the light of news that sea lice figures, recent ones, on the West Coast in some farms are 9 to 10 times higher.
I must hurry you, Mr McGregor.
Yes, than they should be. Will the Minister reconsider their decision not to monitor fish farms for sea lice on an individual basis?
Brief answer, please, Minister.
Well, as the member will know from the debate around the bill, now the Act, that we undertook to look at the provision of voluntary sea lice data and to monitor its performance in practice, whether it's delivering the reputational driver that we wanted in order to drive down sea lice infections. And I give the member a renewed undertaking that is something we will keep under review, and if necessary we have the powers under the 2007 Act to impose a mandatory scheme. But we're not looking at that at this stage because we feel it needs more time to see how the new regime works in practice.
Thank you. That concludes Rural Affairs and Environment questions and brings us to questions on justice and the law officers. Yes. Question number 1, John Wilson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what measures it is taking to stem the reported increasing availability of so-called legal highs.
Minister Rosanna Cunningham.
The classification of drugs is, of course, a reserved matter. However, I did host a national event in April 2013 with representatives from the police, health, local authorities, community and youth organisations to discuss this very issue and agree what can be done. We've already acted on a number of the proposals which emanated from that meeting, and of course we will continue to work with partners across Scotland and indeed the UK to learn more about the impact of these substances.
John Wilson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I thank the Minister for her response. Noting that recent research has highlighted that 47 people have died from using so-called legal highs in Scotland, can I ask what approach is being taken by the police and others with regard to minimising the use amongst school-aged children, especially in Lanarkshire, with much of the packaging aimed at young people, and whether there are going to be any updates or reviews of legislation in conjunction with the UK Government?
Minister.
Well, one of the difficulties, of course, is the enormous challenge these substances present, because they are not in themselves illegal if they are not explicitly sold for human consumption, and that, of course, is how they're marketed. But we do take the issue of substance misuse in schools very seriously, and I would commend the member to the Know the Score free helpline and website, which does ensure that credible information on new drugs is available, which help to challenge the myth that legal equals safe, which is one of the difficulties that we do have, which is why, where possible, we do not use the term legal highs. We prefer to describe them as new psychoactive substances. We continue to work with the UK, but we're also monitoring changes in legislation worldwide to see whether or not other approaches will be feasible. As yet, there is nothing that has been in place long enough to give us any certainty as to whether or not these proposals will work. But we remain on top of this, and of course the member refers to the number of deaths that had implicated these particular substances. That was in fact one of the outcomes from the April meeting, that we would make those figures very clearly separate in the death statistics.
Elaine Murray.
I wondered if the Minister has any estimates about the extent of use of illegal highs in Scotland, because we hear statistics which indicate that drug use is falling in Scotland, but in fact, are we absolutely confident that it's not just a switch from illegal drug use to so-called legal drug use?
Minister.
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer, of course, because they're not recorded in the same way. and therefore we are really in the business at the moment of trying to gather in as much information as is possible in respect of the extent to which they're used. They wouldn't be widespread by any means, but there is no doubt that there are areas and age groups where they may seem more attractive because people are equating the word legal with safe. Again, I want to reiterate that where possible, we shouldn't be using the term legal highs, because that, I think, the fear is giving out a very wrong impression of these. But we are in the process, as I indicated, one of the outcomes from the April meeting. There were some other outcomes as well that we are already putting in place. But actually getting a statistical handle on this is not easy, given that these substances are not criminal substances.
Question number 2, Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what assessment it has made of the Cashback for Communities programme in Fife.
And Cabinet Secretary Kenny McCaskill.
The Government's hugely successful Cashback for Communities programme is having an enormous impact for young people and their communities across the length and breadth of Scotland. Since 2008, Cashback has invested and committed over £74 million in our communities and has provided 1.1 million activities and opportunities for young people. Fife itself has benefited from over £1.3 million in cashback investment and over 55,000 activities and opportunities for its young people.
Annabel Ewing.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his answer, wherein he detailed the significant impact that the Cashback for Communities programme is making in Fife. And I wonder if he could confirm what steps are being taken to ensure that local communities in Fife are fully aware of the next tranche of funding, which I believe is some £24 million, the deadline for applications being the end of this year.
Kenny McCaskill.
The announcement was made on 23rd October that £24 million was to be invested through cashback over the next 3 years. The application pack has been available on the Government's website since 1st November. We have received a large number of queries about funding and applications since the start of November. We always welcome the opportunity to discuss new projects with organisations and communities if they believe they can add to the cashback programme. We do expect that demand will exceed the funds available and not all applicants will be successful, but certainly I do know from having engaged with YouthLink and a variety of youth organisations the length and breadth of Scotland, I think the word is out, and if the member wishes to encourage local groups to apply, I'm sure we will see if we can deliver.
Thank you. Question number 3, Claudia Beamish.
To ask the Scottish Government for what reason it has not undertaken a public consultation on or discussed with relevant organisations the criminalisation of forced marriage.
Cabinet Secretary Kenny McCaskill.
The UK Government's timescale for the potential inclusion of a legislative consent motion in the Anti-Social Behaviour, Crime and Policing Bill did not allow for a public consultation. We are in regular discussion with key stakeholders on this issue, and we were aware that there would be an opportunity to feed in views to the Justice Committee in their consideration of the LCM.
Claudia Beamish.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for explaining the situation in relation to the LCM. However, he will know that Scottish Women's Aid, Hermit Grief Women's Aid and Shakti Women's Aid have concerns about proceeding to criminalisation, and Scottish Women's Aid speaks of evidence from Europe and says that it is difficult for people at risk of forced marriage to report their parents and families to the police or even to pursue civil protection. They often need to be reassured that the protection they seek can be obtained in the family courts and thus that their families will not be prosecuted before they can agree to make a formal statement. Is the Cabinet Secretary in a position to reconsider the present process? And if not, I would encourage him, of course, to take careful account of these concerns highlighted about criminalisation.
Cabinet Secretary.
Take clear account of the organisations that the member correctly mentioned. We do understand the concerns that they have. It's certainly the position of this government and indeed the UK government that we do require to legislate. That's necessary for the Istanbul Agreement and for the Convention to be dealt with. That matter, I think, is disagreed with by some of the organisations referred to, but it's certainly the position of legal advice here south of the border and indeed the position of police and Crown. We do understand the concerns about forcing and driving this situation underground. However, it does appear to us that this already is a situation which, by very nature, does tend to be kept under wraps and in a very secretive basis. This is why we're happy to work with the particular organisation members, with communities in which it tends to be more prevalent than in others, to make it quite clear that forced marriage is unacceptable, to work with the UK Government, because we do believe that there is benefit in having some cross-border parity here, and to ensure that we always remember that the victims of forced marriage are to be treated as victims with dignity and respect. This isn't meant to compound matters, but is meant to ensure that we comply with our international obligations and that those who participate in this can be firmly and appropriately dealt with.
Margaret Mitchell.
To strengthen and tackle the culture surrounding forced marriage, has the Cabinet Secretary considered making a breach of a forced marriage protection order an aggravated offence, especially as the Scottish Parliament took the deliberate decision back in 2011 not to criminalise forced marriage, because the evidence received then and again recently suggests that criminalising would deter rather than encourage individuals to come forward?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, a breach of the civil order is, in fact, a criminal offence. I am open to whether there would be benefits in it being made an aggravation, but certainly to breach the civil order does instigate criminal matters, as we see in other aspects relating, for example, to domestic violence. But I'm happy to consider and reflect upon the member's point.
Question number 4, Alex Ferguson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government when it last met Police Scotland's Divisional Commander for Dumfries and Galloway and what matters were discussed.
Kenny Caskell.
The Divisional Commander for Dumfries and Galloway last met with Scottish Government officials on 13th November. The subject matter discussed was missing persons.
Alex Ferguson.
Thank you for that response, but I'm disappointed here that discussions didn't also surround an event that took place last week, which was the closure, after 558 years of delivering local justice, of the Sheriff and JP Court in Kirkcudbright. That particular town has also just lost its front desk facility at the police station, meaning that those who are asked now to act as witnesses and those who want to report a crime in person will have to do so at either Dumfries, some 30 miles away, or Stranraer, some 50 miles away. So can the Cabinet Secretary tell me how this change is meant to encourage my constituents to voluntarily play their part in bringing criminals to justice, or would he agree with me that these changes are likely to make them a little more reluctant to do so?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, both the Government and indeed all partners involved in law enforcement encourage all members of the public to step forward in whatever capacity, whether to give evidence, whether to go as jurors, or indeed in any other matter. As Mr Ferguson will be aware, this was a decision come to by the Scottish Court Service. I am due to meet with the Lord President later this afternoon, and I can pass on to him Mr Ferguson's position and views. But Mr Ferguson will be aware that as a result of the considerable budgetary cuts forced upon this government by the Westminster coalition government, all aspects of public policy, all areas of public and private life are facing financial challenges. The Lord President has made appropriate matters to deal with the financial challenges, to address matters with some court closures that Mr Ferguson refers to in Kirkcudbright, but which he knows are also replicated, mirrored and indeed in an even greater amount south of the border, where the court closures are even more extensive.
Question number 5, Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how many times Police Scotland has found so-called legal highs cut with illegal substances but not seized them.
Rosanna Cunningham.
Where an unknown substance is believed to contain a controlled drug, it will be seized by the police for the purpose of securing evidence, identification, investigation and potential prosecution. But it is, of course, the potential presence of the controlled substance that triggers a seizure. Information and intelligence obtained is key to this.
Kevin Stewart.
Thank you very much, and I thank the Minister for the answer. I have heard that so-called legal highs, or should I call them psychoactive substances, are sometimes being cut with illegal drugs, and yet there does not seem to be any recording of seizures of legal highs, and the Minister has explained that. Is this a problem that Police Scotland are aware of, and what can be done to ensure that drug dealers cannot entrap people into becoming addicted to illegal drugs by using these nefarious and duplicitous means?
Minister.
Can I thank Kevin Stewart for amending his terminology there. I can advise him, and perhaps it's of interest to John Wilson as well, that currently around 10% of the current monthly caseload of the Scottish Police Authority relates to the analysis of substances suspected of being new psychoactive substances. And the rise in these submissions is both due to improved forensic capability and to increased awareness about and availability of these types of products. Police Scotland is now better placed to identify and respond to the availability of these substances, particularly when they are found to be mixed with controlled drugs. To date, Police Scotland has been required to provide data returns to the Scottish Government on traditional controlled drugs. However, with the emergence of these particular types of products, there is now a requirement to ascertain more specific data around the seizures and the availability of these products. And Police Scotland is well aware of the need for them to keep on top of what is happening, but also for us to understand what is also happening. In respect of the information that is going out to people in terms of drugs education, again, I refer him to my answer to John Wilson, but also to the work, for example, done by CREW to try and keep people as well informed as possible.
Thank you. Question number 6, Ken McIntosh.
What discussions the Cabinet Secretary for Justice has had with the Chief Constable regarding the publication of crime statistics.
Cabinet Secretary.
I meet with Chief Constable Sir Stephen House on a regular basis to discuss important issues around keeping people safe in Scotland. Most recently, I of course met with the Chief Constable during the aftermath of the tragic incident at the Clutha Bar in Glasgow on Friday. On Saturday, we were both at the Helen Street Control Centre and on Sunday at the service at Glasgow Cathedral.
Ken McIntosh.
Can I thank the Minister for those remarks? The Minister will be aware of the Auditor General's recent report on police reform and her comments in that report that the information provided to the new Scottish Police Authority is more selective, I should say, and less comprehensive than that previously presented to boards. Is he also aware of the comments of the Chief Constable to the Audit Committee that the publication of crime statistics are a matter for the government and not for him, that the matter is a source of some frustration for him, and that it is certainly not due to reticence on his behalf? Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if he will ease that frustration and if he will assure both the Parliament and the public that the information will be as comprehensive as previously published?
Cabinet Secretary.
Absolutely, I can assure him that. I think what's being attempted to be achieved by both the SPA and the Chief Constable, supported by the Scottish Government and officials in the Justice Directorate, is to ensure that we have comparable and indeed up-to-date figures, that they are reflective across the nation as opposed to individual constabularies having different ways of reporting matters. That is why the Chief welcomed the comments made by Audit Scotland. SPA, the Chief Justice officials are working together and, of course, working closely with HM Inspector of Constabulary to ensure that the best possible information is available, that information is information that should be comparable across Scotland and should be appropriate for those who are charged with holding the police to account, whether here or at the SPA.
Thank you. Question number 7, Mike Mackenzie.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on the number of convictions for firearm offences in 2013.
Cabinet Secretary.
The annual bulletin, Recorded Crimes and Offences Involving Firearms Scotland 2012-13, was published on 20th November. This showed that gun crime fell by 32% in the year to March. This is down 71% since 2006-07, and gun crime is now at its lowest level for 33 years.
Mike Mackenzie.
My view that having specialist services available, which may not have been available to regional forces, Police Scotland is in a better position to deal with serious crimes like firearms offences.
Cabinet Secretary.
Absolutely, I would accept that. I think we've seen the benefit of specialist services, the benefit of a single service at recent tragedies, whether in Glasgow or indeed in Shetland, when resources were called upon and used. They were available nationally. Equally, we also, I would say, don't have artificial boundaries. I do remember meeting with the armed response officers covering the Highlands of Scotland out of Inverness, when it became quite clear that previously the historical position of having driven to Dalcross and turned around actually resulted in them now going on to cover, for example, Elgin, because it's quicker and easier for officers from Inverness to get to Elgin than it would have been for the historic forces covering the Grampian area to have got from Aberdeen City to Elgin. So I think citizens can be reassured. Local policing is still the bedrock, but national services are available wherever they are needed, whether in the Highlands or the Islands.
Question number 8, Mary Fee.
Presiding Officer, to ask the Scottish Government what impact the closure of police stations in West Scotland will have on community safety.
Cabinet Secretary.
The review of public counter provision is a matter for Police Scotland. Police Scotland has focused its review on front counter provision, not stations. The closure of counters which are not widely used aims to help deliver a more consistent professional service to the public and enable more officers to be deployed where the public tell us they want them in our communities. Indeed, the Lord Stevens chaired Independent Commission for Policing, published on 25th November, recognises the benefit of our reform, and I quote, "The Commission recommends that the social purpose of the police should be enshrined in law." It goes on, "This has recently been achieved in Scotland. We believe that the National Statement of Purpose for Police Scotland is much to commend it as a model for enacting a legislative purpose for the police in England and Wales." I commend that report commissioned by the Labour Party.
And a brief supplementary and a brief answer, Mary Fee.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his answer? The west of Scotland, if you include Glasgow and North Ayrshire and Inverclyde, is listed as being one of the top 5 least peaceful areas in Scotland. If a community can put forward a compelling case for keeping a counter open, will he take on board these views and listen to the opinions of local people?
Cabinet Secretary, as briefly as possible.
Well, I think ACC Mawson commented today that the counter consultation had contributions from 83 members of the public in a population of 5.3 million.
Thank you. That concludes questions, and we move to the next item.